dear colleagues, dear young and much younger friends. Yes, I have a very deep personal drive to travel to Central Asia. At first, I tried to follow some old Hungarian scientific traditions of Kőrösi Csoma Sándor, or from Kőrösi Csoma Sándor to Zoltán Kaszab, from ethnographs and linguists to entomologists, and I have also a favorite group of insects, a very diverse group, the Noctuid moths. These two motivations are connected during my research trips in Central Asia, not only in Kazakhstan, but mostly. And I had a basic problem. The basic problem was the origin of so-called Pannonian steppe areas. These Pannonian steppe areas are very extended on the Hungarian lowland, for example, here in Kiskunság, but they are also on the slopes on the central Hungarian range, and the higher species diversity are present on these slopes. It was an old theory on the origin of this type of vegetation, decline from the mountains to the lowland steppes. And I tried how this process functioned not within the Carpathian Basin, but on the whole Eurasiatic continent. So, in a much larger dimension. And therefore, I needed a good target group, a focal group with high diversity. One possibility would be the butterflies. The butterflies, here you can see an example from the recent literature, and you can see that this group, this so-called Melitene tribe, is very colorful, is mostly represented here in this area of Central Asia. These are different mountains from the western parts of Tian Shan and Pamirs to the Mongolian Altai area. And you can see that the most of these species, here you can see the highest diversity, is present in these areas, but different branches of this dendrogram are present here also in Europe, and in Central and Eastern Europe, in the orographic and in the zonal steppic areas of Europe. So this is a good model group, but not very diverse. The Noctuid moths are much more diverse. For example, only the genus Euxoa consists of more than 300 species. And what was my program? Program during 40 years to visit these mountain areas, and these mountain areas are usually separated by deserts. Here, east of the Caspian Sea, you can see this huge and extremely desert area, which surrounds, for example, the Aral Sea, which is, in a heavy decline. It is mostly dried out. And also the more eastern mountains, surrounded by the Pamirs and Himalaya, and the north, mostly from the Tian Shan and Altai mountain system, they are also surrounding an elevated dry area, mostly the Tibet Plateau. So, now I try to show you the parts in Kazakhstan marked with 3 and partly with 4. These are the mountains and the arid areas, the steppe and desert areas of Kazakhstan. At first, the lowland deserts. The lowland deserts are surrounded usually with mountains, and the precipitation falls mostly in these mountain areas, and the sandy and or stony deserts are extremely dry and covered only by the very scarce scrubby vegetation, and with such animals as, for example, this agama or some viper species which occur in this area, and of course the prey animals are mostly rodents. In other areas, these semi-desert areas are crossed by rivers, and this is the background of the very diverse habitats: rocks with inscripts from early historical times, rupicolous slopes, and different areas with sandy or pebble vegetation, scrubby or grass vegetation, with meloids. These are poisonous insects with a very special life history. And also, this is an important habitat also for Noctuid moths. These areas are mostly surrounded by higher mountains. These deeply eroded valleys are also mostly dry, you can see here, and populated by different grasshoppers and locusts, and also by very rich communities of Noctuid moths. One example from the genus Eugnorisma. This is one of the surveyed species groups during my studies. And the different types of rocks are also very important for the vegetation and for the faunal composition. Volcanic rocks, rich in metals, and mostly sandstones deeply eroded, like the Great Canyon in North America, with very interesting endemic plants from the group of Plumbaginaceae and Caryophyllaceae, and these areas are also very rich in different grasshoppers with colored hind wings, reddish or bluish. There are different genera and different groups of these animals and life forms. These are mostly connected to such surfaces which have a very high temperature fluctuation during daytime. Between these rupicolous mountains, there are plateau like surfaces covered by a steppe vegetation. The steppe vegetation is richly patterned because the grazing and the defense of the different plants cause a patch-like dispersion of the vegetation. There are thorny and aromatic plants or poisonous plants, and even the grasses, for example, the feather grass, can survive under the protection of such scrubs which are defended mechanically or chemically against the grazing. And this is the landscape and our way of life in such situations. A little bit higher. This was a medium elevation in the picture before. A higher elevation is in the coniferous zone, which is not a continuous zone, but it is subdivided by mountains, tall grass, so-called meadow steppes, with vegetation like in less steppic areas in the Carpathian Basin. For example, the dominance of Phlomis tuberosa is one of the common features, but the differential feature that connected with the higher elevation, also such plants appear here, which are typical in Europe for the higher elevations of the mountains, for example, this Leontopodium. And these are, of course, also populated by a lot of species of Noctuid moths, for example, here, Cazotis. This is not the uppermost level, of course. The next level in these mountains may be differentiated according to the amount of precipitation. In mountains, in areas with a higher precipitation, it is typical that near to the timberline you can see a so-called humid tall herb vegetation, more humid and a little bit more arid, but tall herb vegetation with scrubs and broadleaf trees, and also with this coniferous zone, which will be scattered by the elevation and change into rupicolous habitats. These rupicolous habitats are the home ranges of the Apollo butterflies and a lot of satyri. Higher and a little bit more less precipitous area is this higher part of the Sarjas Mountains. This is a part of the Tian Shan range on the border of China and Kazakhstan. Here we are in the nearest neighborhood of China, and this is the typical picture of this area. Grazed different types of grassland and scrubs, not very heavily, but grazed, usually grazed. But in the deeper and the more northern slopes, with forest of Picea schrankiana, this is more aridity tolerant coniferous species than the European Picea species. Therefore, there are some forestry experiments also in Europe with this species. And these are the typical noctuid moths and wingless grasshoppers, Catantopini subfamily mostly, and these are typical noctuids, Diagiris and the Euxoa species. These are the two most diverse species-rich genus in which also molecular surveys are already going. And the highest level, here some pictures from my colleague and friend Schramko Gabor. He took these pictures, including me, and the most extreme habitat is surrounded by the highest mountains. Here, this is the highest part of the Tian Shan Mountains. This is the so-called Kantengri. Translation about the god or ghost of the eternity. So, in the old religion of this population. So, this is the most extreme. These are the most extreme conditions, which also has a population of noctuid moths, a relatively diverse component in noctuid moths because of sandy, saline, or rupicolous habitats. And now, the animals, the noctuid moths. I have mentioned that these noctuid moths are mostly connected with steppic habitats. Steppic habitats, mountain steppic habitats, or mostly or mountain rupicolous formations. The areas of this species are greatly similar. They include mostly the Central Asiatic mountains, surrounding of these deserts, also here, and some species can reach the steppic areas of Eastern or Eastern Central Europe, or even in drier parts of the Alps, or in the Eastern Mediterranean mountains too. These are the most expansive species, but the higher diversity of such faunal elements here is mostly in these regions. So, the question, what is the background that such elements can expand westwards, and which are the adaptation during this process, which are the evolutionary phenomena during this process. At first, you have seen that the first step was the mapping of the range. The first step is the mostly exact mapping of the range. And the next step, making a phylogenetic hypothesis based on the range. For example, one species with a hypothetical sister group here, and another species with a hypothetical sister group here. What is the next step? To confirm this hypothesis by morphological, morphophysiological, and genetic methods. These are the next steps. Here, one of the target groups. This target groups is most interesting because there are 4 species which are represented only in very, very limited small areas. For example, here this is the Hindu Kush Mountains. And there are more widely distributed species. These are so surrounded. One species here in Western Asia and Asia Minor, and its sister species, proposed hypothetic sister species here in the area in Kazakhstan mostly, in Kazakhstan and in some surrounding areas. What is the background of this interesting pattern? 4 species in very, very small, very limited spots, and 2 species with large extension, and these extended species are the sister groups to each other. What is the background? We will see it. Another similar example. Another genus, not the Kerzotis, this is the Eugnurhisma. Here you can see also very local species, very limited species, for example, here in the Kazakhstan Mountains on the borderline of Iran and Turkmenistan, and another on the border area of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, and a higher diversity in the areas from Afghanistan to the southern Russian steppe mountains, inclusive Kazakhstan. You can see a relative higher diversity here in this area. But 2 of these species, one blue and the other species, which are more extended in this range, they have occurrences also on the steppe areas to the lower Volga area in Russia. And this pattern is iterating into phylogenetically independent group. What is the explanation of these patterns? And this is the next step. At first, what is the common in such species which have only spot-like occurrences? They have very narrow abdomens without larger fat bodies. And what is the characteristic of such animals which are widely distributed in these mountain steppe areas, here and here? The common physiological property of these 2 species are the thick and flattened abdomen full with fat bodies. Full with fat bodies. And what is the explanation of this phenomenon? These moths appear at the early summer. During the arid period of the summer, dry estivating, and the oviposition period is after the estivation in the early autumn period, and these are during the short period polyandric. It means that one female will copulate and fertilize by several males in short sequence within some few days. So, accumulation of the energy by active feeding at the early summer, estimating inactive period during the hot period of the summer, and elevated sexual activity after this resting period, and and they have mostly eggs which have the young larvae in the eggshell during the winter, and the larval feeding begins in the early spring. This is the solution of such moths. The species from this group without expansion capacity, they don't have this possibility. They emerge in the high mountains in the summer, and because the summer period is in the high elevations of the mountains is very short, I cannot play this role. The mostly extended steppe species can adapt, and this is one basic possibility of adaptation for a longer vegetation period by estivation and a high level of fertility due to this polyandry. The other version, which we have seen here in this genus, they have another strategy, other survival strategy, because they have an elongate period of larval feeding, and the dry period will survive by the pupa. And the moths appear only at the early autumn, and also in this case, a very short period of copulation and fertilization and oviposition, and the hibernation, the young larvae hibernating in eggshells, and the larval feeding is nearly the same in both groups. The survival in the critical period of summer aridity. Solution, pupa, solution estimating imago. And this is the solution in two independent phylogenetic groups. And now preliminary generalization. During the study of different mountains and different groups of Noctuid moths, we have seen that the largest species diversity is in this western Chinese mountainous area. And this is also the same in birds and amphibians and many other groups. This is the area of a high diversity coming from the Gondwana during the earlier times, end of the Mesozoic period and the early Tertiary. And there are two main filters, and in our case, in the Noctuid case, this aridity filter is the most interesting and important, and this aridity filter will survive here in these mountainous areas which I have surveyed. This is the critical area of differentiation and the critical area for expansion to the zonal steppes and to the expansion into the areas of southern Europe, and the other filter from southern Siberia. This is the more humid corridor, reaching one side to Central Europe and in northeast to the Beringia and across the Beringia to North America. Ornithologists have discovered also a very similar pattern, you can see. The highest diversity of several passeriform groups is here in this area, and the two basic directions of differentiation are nearly the same as here in Noctuid moths, so it is very useful to survey the similar patterns, to analyze the similar patterns. You can get some ideas on the origin if you compare different groups, for example, the Noctuid moths and birds of the Central Asiatic areas. And these were the preliminary conclusion of my trips during these last years and occasions. So, and the personal fascination was perhaps the most important. I cannot forget these landscapes, and I cannot forget my colleagues and friends who participated during these trips and helped my surveys and researches on these areas. Thank you very much.